Good evening and welcome to A Deadly Silence. I'm your host, Larry Curtis. It is the goal of all of us associated with our program to bring you current and educational information associated with the drug and alcohol epidemic, not only here in the city of Brockton, but throughout many of our South Shore communities. This evening, our special guest is Kaitlyn Oberle. Did I say that right, Kaitlyn?
Almost. Kaitlyn Oberle.
Oberle. Kaitlyn is here. She is a sister of two young brothers that one has passed along as a result of the substance epidemic, in addition to another brother that is in long-term recovery. And you're here to kind of share with us the impact of a loved one in the passing as well as the continuing long-term recovery of substance abuse.
Thank you for having me, Larry.
Well, thank you for coming here. And I do want to say that Kaitlyn and I met a few weeks back at the Brockton Vigil over at Massasoit Community College, and you spoke there, a very powerful speech that you'll share some of that with us this evening as well. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Appreciate you having me.
And condolences on the loss of your
Thank
brother,
you.
obviously. Yes. So tell us a little bit of what happened.
So I have two brothers, second oldest of 5 children. And I think the typical dialogue that you'll hear about substance use disorder in the current epidemic is that it's hitting suburbia, which not to minimize the impact of an overdose to any other socioeconomic group, but I think it's becoming very prominent in communities that never once really felt that impact of the drug epidemic. So my family, much like many other families that I've met at the vigils in Washington this last weekend, are your traditional, typical families, married husbands and wives.
The blue-collar, white-collar worker. Exactly.
Exactly. And no signs of any struggles at home. And then all of a sudden they're surprised to find that there is a substance use problem in their own family. So my family is not unlike many of the other families that have buried a loved one in 2015, 2016, and I'm sure the next few years to come, even more will be buried. And as you know, as the dialogue goes, a lot of these young substance use disorder patients, victims, if you will, started their substance use with prescription. So may have gotten some type of sports-related injury. Both my brothers suffered from some type of accident in high school. And
then they were prescribed the opioid painkiller for whatever the ailment was at that time.
Correct. Mm-hmm. And from then transitioned into street or illicit drug use.
Illicit drug use into heroin.
And,
basically.
Yep. And then heroin, and as we're now finding most of that is now fentanyl, which is even deadlier than heroin. Or they're both deadly, but more prominent and stronger.
Yeah, I mean, the potency of what's out there today is nobody can really measure it because nobody knows what's happening with the mixture as they cut it and mix it, right?
Exactly.
So talk a little bit about your experience as a sibling of your loved ones, your brothers, as they started to spiral.
Yeah, so I think that there's a much different perspective being the sibling than it is being the parent of a user, an addict. And that is because I don't know how strong a parent's love is. I can't compare my love as a sibling to the love of a parent.
Fair statement.
And so you, as a sibling, you can kind of remove yourself from the situation, and you can see as an outsider looking in perhaps some enabling behaviors, some things that you would do differently. And as a sibling, I was able to stand my ground and try to draw a distinct line in the sand where my presence began and where it ended. And so I put conditions on my presence. I always made my love known and unconditional, but my tolerance for some of their addictive behaviors was a little less than, or Yeah, my tolerance was less than that of my parents.
Way to put the loyalty between the loyalty to your brothers versus the parents.
I know.
A fine line, I'm sure, at certain point in times. Yep.
Exactly. So with that being said, I was able to know the value and worth of my own mental health and my own personal growth as a young adult, and seeing that sometimes I would have to put that wall up in order to progress as a young adult myself. It was a struggle because it sometimes meant going against my mother's wishes or my brother's requests for help. But in the end...
For help or for enabling? I mean,
exactly.
That's another one of the catch-22s.
It is a catch-22.
Yeah.
And any person that has lived with an addict in their family probably can put themselves in that same position where they have, thought about helping, but are they really helping? Giving, my brothers a place to crash on the couch for a night or a week. Giving them money because they can't pay their cell phone bill, but it's really not going towards their cell phone bill. So you put up that wall, and eventually I had to walk away. So, there was a period of my time, if we look at the timeline, my brothers are younger than me. So they both had about a 10-year history of drug use. There was a period in time I probably didn't talk to either one of them for a year. And during that time, I wouldn't have been shocked to have gotten that phone call that either one of them had passed away. But it made me realize that they were going to have to want to get better themselves.
You struck a nerve with me because I have two sons that now in long-term recovery that were caught up in the heroin addiction arena, and I can recall coming to a point in my life for my sanity that I may get that call. Yeah. And I've resigned myself to the fact that I may get that call because of the actions that, that were being done on the part of my son and the substance abuse that was taking place with him. What I couldn't bring myself to do and recognize was that if by his actions he were to have hurt or killed somebody else. That was... Yeah,
because as a parent, you probably have some sense of responsibility for your child's actions.
Absolutely, yeah.
I will say, Larry, that I did do this. For each of my brothers on separate occasions, I did petition a judge. I went to a court, signed a Section 35.
Section 35, yep.
Which I have many friends who have gone through the same thing as a sibling, and I've given them, the course of action on how to do it. But I said this both to the judge and to my brothers. I will only stand in front of this court once to show that I love you, to show that I care, and I know that standing behind that glass wall, you're very upset with me. But this is me showing my love for you when you can't see it yourself. And so
perfect analogy, because even as a parent, it's the same thing. And I'd take it to the extent of that. I'm going to be able to sleep well tonight because I know where you're going to be in the care of hopefully clinical caregivers, even though it's a little bit of an incarceration aspect as well.
It really, and it's disappointing and upsetting to know that you're putting them in that position, but then you have to remind yourself that they put themselves in that position.
Exactly. Right.
Well, I distinctly remember the morning that I went to court from Greg, my brother that has passed away. And it was about 16 months before he passed away. And it's what kickstarted his 14 months of sobriety, more or less.
Yep.
And I remember laying in bed. I'd probably gotten about 3 hours of sleep, and I thought to myself, I just want to sleep in. I have the opportunity to sleep in, but I had this nagging feeling that, if I don't do this, I had gotten some intel from someone that he had been using that night. If I don't do this and something happens to him, can I live with that?
Yeah.
So I went to the judge, and it was granted. And my brother is very unhappy with me as you can imagine.
As they all are.
However, it started a dialogue and it had, between us, and we exchanged letters while he was, incarcerated for a short period of time, and then through treatment. And when he got out, we came up with a plan, and he went up to Portland, Maine, and he formulated this own plan on his own. And I said, I am here to help you. You are guiding yourself on this journey, and I'll help you as needed, but this is your journey to guide, not my journey to guide for you. And he really, you could see how rewarding it was to regain respect. And he knew that he had lost that respect, but he knew that he had the opportunity to regain it. So that last year of his life was probably the best year of our adult relationship, because he had struggled for 10 years. He couldn't be trusted. But when he was clean, when he was living, quote, the good life, as he called recovery the good life, he was a great brother. He was always calling to ask if he could help with anything, and knowing that he was regaining trust was important to him.
Yep.
So I am grateful for that.
That takes time.
That takes a lot of time.
That takes time, even as a brother or a son or a daughter, because of, as you said, the 10-year history that, took place. It's hard to, and the fact that relapse is a reality.
It is.
Of the recovery cycle, unfortunately. Yep. We hear and see that constantly out there,
It is.
Yep.
It is. And it's something that always will live as an anxiety to anyone that has a loved one in recovery. You always hope it never happens.
Now, how was the parental side of things dealing with the whole 10-year episode?
So there were times I didn't speak to my mother.
Yeah.
And it was for the same reason. I as a consequence to your actions, I can't be present in your life. And that's hard because there's this contingency on how her behaviors and her relationship with her sons are compared to her other children. And she saw, her daughters, there's 3 girls and 2 boys, she saw her daughters as okay and stable on their own, and her sons needed her, and that creates a bit of a conflict within the family dynamic. And there's a little bit of a battle of favoritism and who, who's more important and who has preferential treatment. So there's definitely a dynamic there.
There's a dynamic there, because I can even recall with my oldest son how I classified as how protective his mother was of him,
right.
And whether you want to classify it in enabling or whatever.
Yes.
And I was the steadfast, hang him out to dry type of a father, But then all of a sudden, those roles shifted literally overnight, where Peggy became the
iron fist.
The iron fist, and I'm like, no, time out here, that's your son you're talking about,
right.
And I sat there one time going, what just happened?
I know.
The dynamics are just incredible sometimes out there, but the love that you have, whether you're the parent or you're the sibling, in your case, never fades, and you always want what's best, for, the sibling who's struggling out there. One of your brothers passed on. What happened there?
So he was doing well. He was doing very well. He had just gotten a job promotion, and our conversations were in the last about, I would say, 3 to 4 months of his life. Obviously, not knowing that was the last 3 to 4 months of his life, because his death was so sudden and unexpected. Most of our conversations revolved around his growth. So, he was 27 years old when he passed away. He never finished his bachelor's degree. He had always saw himself as someone working in the business world, and he worked in retail customer service when he passed away, and he was very frustrated because he knew he had a bigger potential, and he was more ambitious than that. So he really struggled with, how do I accomplish this goal? So our conversations were circled around, how can he afford to live and how can he afford to go to school and pay for school, and that different dynamic as an adult going to school versus an 18-year-old right out of high school going to school and finishing the few classes that he had. So we had come up with the plan, a savings plan. So I was going to sponsor him, give him the sister scholarship for his first class, when he was going to set aside money for his next class. So he had set up $25 a week he's putting into account, and that was we worked out the math, that was gonna be enough for for him to pay his way. So he just needed help to kickstart him on that first class. And after his passing, I found out he really was doing that. He had the money on automatic transfer and everything. He had gone the morning of his passing. He passed away in Brockton in his car. In the morning of his passing, he had gone to Massasoit. He had circled all the classes he was taking. And I was actually traveling overseas to Italy. I was going on a three-week trip. I was going to miss Thanksgiving, so I had talked to him that morning. And I said, hey, I'll have a good Thanksgiving. I'll see you, I'll talk to you when I get back. And I'm going to Italy. And he said, okay, have fun. A couple hours later, I got a text message saying, can I call you? And I said, I'm in the air. I was on a plane. I was in the air. I had some Wi-Fi, so I was receiving text messages. And he said, I'm just stressed out, and I want to talk to you. And I said, well, I probably won't be able to talk to you until I get to Italy. And he said, well, can we, Skype or FaceTime when you get there? And I said, sure, not a problem. I'll, probably tomorrow morning. He said, I have the day off. That's great. Well, it was actually the night of the Paris bombing, so my flight was delayed. And so I had an opportunity to call him. So around 7:30 at night, I called him, and I had received a text message from him at 7:24. At 7:30, I called him, and he didn't answer. At 8 p.m., there was a passerby that called 911. In the exchange of our last text messages, the last thing he said to me was, I'm just stressed, need to talk through some things, but don't worry, I'm 14 going on 15 months strong, I won't relapse. So I actually had a layover in Ireland, and when I got off the plane, I received a phone call that he had passed away.
Oh my God.
So.
And, your other brother that's in long-term recovery now, what was the impact there?
That was my biggest fear. Being in a different country, my biggest fear was, how is he taking it?
Yeah.
Because
is it a trigger?
Is it a trigger?
Yeah.
And knowing traditional coping mechanisms, for instance, the coping mechanisms of the Irish is to drink. Yeah. So I was in Ireland, and I was with a bunch of Irishmen who wanted to just give me some whiskey shots and some beer and cheers and sing some Irish blessings, and that was the cultural coping mechanism for everyone to offer me. So knowing that he's substance free, and how is he going to cope? I don't think it's wrong that's oftentimes a society's response, but knowing he has removed those coping mechanisms from his life, there's definitely that fear
of
relapsing.
Absolutely.
And I give him a lot of credit for fighting through all that. When he did see other people, especially at the funeral afterwards, and through the months after, it's a hard thing to.
It had to be a real tremendous shock, because, as you said, he was 14 to 15 months in long-term recovery.
Right.
And as you had mentioned, working with other family members, putting his life together, and looking forward to the future, and to all of a sudden have that happen. And I think that's something that none of us understand.
No.
What triggered, the need, that desire?
I have I've stared at the ceiling many hours over the past 10 months and thought, what was he thinking in those final moments? And I know he was having some issues with his girlfriend. I know that there was a conflict between them. And I know that he had his own inner conflict with where he was in his life, how much he was so aware of how much his addiction had set him back
Cost
on
him.
his time.
Right.
Yeah, it cost him time on his goals.
Right.
So I know that was a struggle for him. He wanted more out of life. And so when I think to myself, just as an individual, as a sister, how much I've progressed in understanding the disease, I think 3 years ago I would have been mad at him, upset with him, but in the past 10 months, the only thing that goes through my head is how sad I am for him, that he was that depressed, that he was alone in a car by himself and struggling with whatever inner struggles he had. He sought out a coping mechanism that was comfortable for him, that was familiar for him, that made him feel better and made him feel normal. And I know that's something that's hard for people to understand, and I struggle with understanding it myself, but oftentimes the person with substance use disorder uses to feel normal because they don't feel normal without a substance. So I have nothing but sadness for him that he was alone, feeling that way, and willing to give up all his progress to deal or cope with whatever he was going through.
Given what I call the emotional roller coaster of the substance abuse disorder, that not only the person who is dealing with the substance abuse disorder, but we as family members, what triggered you to become a spokesperson? Because that's really what you are today. You know, I listened to you at the visual, passionate, you know, and you touched on an element that a lot of people don't even think of, and that's the impact of the family.
Yeah.
You know.
I have a wide range of perspective. We haven't discussed it, but I worked as a paramedic for many years. In that capacity, I started to develop compassion fatigue, where you go to overdose after overdose after overdose, and you see everyone around you fed up.
No pun intended from the national rally, but
yeah,
absolutely, yes.
Just really fed up and frustrated with people's, what I saw at the time as negligence to use drugs and the selfishness behind it, and seeing babies cry because their parents are passed out and being raised by grandparents, and being woken up in the middle of the night. You know, I definitely developed that compassion fatigue, and I didn't understand the struggles of the family. I didn't understand the struggles of the addict. Do I think every addict is innocent and, you know, and deserving to be coddled? No. I think that addictive behaviors are your own responsibility, but I think that we need to give everyone the opportunity to seek treatment and help and be supportive when they are in seek of that treatment. So over the years, I can tell you 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't be saying what I'm saying to you right now, but I noticed through my own personal experience that it takes living through it to change your impression and to destigmatize addiction. And it's really hard to ask that of someone who has never experienced it. So if I can share my story to other people in hopes that they'll also destigmatize it, and that there'll be just as much programs and funding for addiction as there are for diabetes and heart disease and all the other ailments that plague America, that I think that we'll be in a better place in 5 to 10 years.
It's going to take a while, as we saw on the National Fed Up rally during the weekend of September 17th and 18th, that almost on the local level, the strides that we've made, you know, we've heard many times about, you know, getting our first responders, you know, equipped with the Narcan, you know, while some people think we're just, you know, preventing the inevitable on people that are being saved. We know that the funding is going to be a significant issue, even though they passing laws that are going to help.
Right.
You know, the reality is, if the funds aren't there to support the law, it's a worthless law.
Yeah.
You know, what was your sense in Washington this weekend? Was your first Fed Up rally?
That was my first Fed Up rally. Yeah. My sense was I got a better picture of what the most startling thing to me was the comparison of numbers to the AIDS epidemic, the Vietnam War, when it was said that that more people will die this year from an opioid overdose, whether it's illicit drugs or prescription drugs,
right. Mm-hmm.
Putting that in the same category, than all of the Vietnam War. That's a startling comparison. I mean, that's huge. I mean, we have national memorials set up for everyone that's been lost in the Vietnam War, and it's the same. It's about pretty much the same generation.
And that was a 10-year. That was a 10-year effort.
And that was a 10-year effort. Yeah,
50 some odd thousand.
Yeah.
Veterans that didn't come home.
Right, and and God bless every one of their souls. I'm not saying that our loved ones' loss are any more or less important than their ones, but just think of the magnitude and impact that had on the community, and that's how many people are going to die each year in the next couple of years, because we're only seeing an exponential increase in rise.
Exactly. And the frightening part of that is that as those of us who are now involved in the addiction recovery education arena, we believe that we're getting out much more information, much more educational information, and we would hope that the pendulum of deaths would reverse, but we're not seeing that. We're seeing it continuing to rise.
Yes.
And that's a frightening.
It is frightening.
Aspect,
It is very frightening.
Well, as we saw here in the Commonwealth, 1,531 souls were lost in 2015, and we had good representation in the state of Massachusetts out there at the national Fed Up rally, and we got to continue the.
I agree.
Continue the message out there.
And from speaking with everyone in Washington, I think Massachusetts is ahead of the game when it comes to the progressive movement. But the funding is still lacking, and it needs to be addressed at both the local and federal level.
I will say, politically, and here in the Commonwealth, back in 2013, when Governor Deval Patrick, declared it a public health crisis, and when he left office and Republican Governor Charlie Baker came in, he continued, picking up the mantle and running with it, and the opioid working group that took place in 2014 and the recommendations that came out in 2015. We've seen some great progress here in Massachusetts that we're not seeing elsewhere across the country.
Yes, correct.
But we'll continue to give the message. Yep. We've got about a minute or so left. What would you want to say to the listeners out there about, the signs or what to be aware of?
So I think the most important thing that I've learned in my journey is do not be afraid to upset a loved one. They will come around and realize it. You're going to test some waters that are going to rock your relationships, but in the end, the hope is that they will find recovery, and you're there to support and love them and help them along the way. So stand your ground and
stand your ground, because what I found is that you're not addressing your loved one, whether it be a sibling or your son or daughter. It's the drug that's being responsive to what you're trying to do out there, and until they make that commitment to want to get clean, you still need to advocate for them.
Yes, you do.
in a number of ways out there.
Tough love.
Tough love is another way of putting it. Absolutely, But love will
is
conquer
the most
all,
important.
We're out of time here. I do want to thank you for coming in and sharing with us your story. Our condolences on the loss of your brother, and but more importantly, it's a real message that needs to be communicated out there to our listeners. And on behalf of all of us here at A Deadly Silence, we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
Kaitlyn, thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.